Maria Santos wiped down the same table for the third time that morning, her movements slow and deliberate. The young Marines at Camp Pendleton barely noticed her as they rushed through the mess hall, grabbing their breakfast trays and joking loudly with each other. To them, she was just another face in the background. A middle-aged woman, with graying hair, tied back in a simple ponytail, who kept the dining area clean. At 52, Maria had been working at the base for almost 3 years. She arrived every morning at 5:30 sharp, put on her blue uniform shirt, and began her quiet routine. She never complained, never caused trouble, and rarely spoke unless someone asked her a direct question. The Marines had nicknamed her Ghost because she seemed to glide through the dining hall without making a sound. Lance Corporal Jake Morrison was different from the others. While his buddies cracked jokes about the old lady with the mop, Jake always nodded politely when Maria walked past. He noticed things others missed: how she always made sure the coffee was fresh before the early morning PT formation, how she kept extra napkins stocked during messy mealtimes, and how she never left a spill unattended for more than a few seconds. One rainy Tuesday morning, Jake was sitting alone at a corner table, staring at a letter from home. His younger brother had been in a car accident, and Jake felt helpless being so far away. He didn't notice Maria approaching until she quietly set down a fresh cup of coffee next to his elbow. "Everything okay, Marine?" she asked softly, her voice carrying a slight accent that Jake couldn't quite place. Jake looked up, surprised. In 3 years, he'd never heard Maria initiate a conversation with anyone. Her dark eyes showed genuine concern, and something else he couldn't identify. A kind of understanding that seemed deeper than her role as a dining hall worker should provide. "Family stuff," Jake replied, not wanting to burden her with his problems. Maria nodded and started to walk away, then paused. "Sometimes being far from home makes everything feel bigger than it is," she said. "Your family knows you're here doing important work. That matters more than being close by when trouble hits." The way she said it made Jake look at her differently. There was something in her tone, a certainty that suggested she'd been in similar situations before. But before he could ask anything, she had already moved on to the next table. Over the following weeks, Jake started paying more attention to Maria. He noticed she arrived at work with perfect punctuality, something drilled into Marines during basic training. Her posture was always straight, her movements efficient and purposeful. When she lifted heavy boxes of supplies, she used proper form that prevented injury. These weren't things a typical civilian worker would necessarily know. The other Marines in Jake's unit, Corporal Tommy Chen, Lance Corporal Sarah Williams, and Private First Class Marcus Johnson, thought Jake was imagining things when he mentioned his observations. "Dude, she's just a cleaning lady," Tommy said during lunch one day, speaking loudly enough that Maria could probably hear him from across the dining hall. "Why are you making this weird?" But Jake noticed Maria's jaw tighten slightly when Tommy spoke, though she continued wiping tables without looking their way. Sarah, who was more observant than the guys, followed Jake's gaze and studied Maria for a moment. "Actually," Sarah said quietly, "Jake might be onto something. Look at how she stands. That's military bearing if I've ever seen it." Marcus laughed. "You're both crazy. Next you'll be telling us she's some kind of secret agent or something." The conversation might have ended there. But something happened the following week that made everyone take notice. A new group of Marines had arrived for training, and among them was a loud, arrogant corporal named Rick Davies, who seemed to think his 2 years in the Corps made him superior to everyone around him. Davies had been making crude comments about the civilian workers since his arrival, but he particularly enjoyed targeting Maria. He would deliberately make messes at his table, knock over salt shakers, and laugh when she had to clean up after him. "Hey, mamacita," he called out one morning as Maria approached with her cleaning supplies. "Missed a spot over here. Maybe you need glasses, old lady. Maybe you need glasses." Jake felt his hands clench into fists under the table. Several other Marines looked uncomfortable, but no one said anything. Davies was technically senior to most of them, and confronting another Marine over a civilian worker seemed like a quick way to earn unwanted attention from their superiors. Maria said nothing, simply began cleaning the area Davies had pointed to. But Jake saw her shoulders tense, and for just a moment, her movements became sharper, more aggressive. It was subtle, but it reminded him of how his drill instructors moved when they were controlling their temper. The harassment continued for several days. Davies seemed to take pleasure in finding new ways to make Maria's job more difficult. He would spill things intentionally, make offensive comments about her accent, and encourage other Marines to join in the fun. Most of the dining hall staff had learned to ignore Davies, but Jake could see that Maria was reaching her limit. There was something building behind her calm exterior, like pressure building up in a container that was about to explode. The question was, what would happen when that pressure was finally released? Jake had no idea that he was about to find out, and that when he did, everything he thought he knew about the quiet woman with the mop would change forever. The breaking point came on a Friday morning during the breakfast rush. Davies had been particularly obnoxious all week, and his behavior was getting worse. He'd started recruiting some of the newer Marines to join his harassment campaign, turning it into a group activity that made Maria's shifts increasingly uncomfortable. Jake watched from across the dining hall as Davies deliberately knocked over a full cup of orange juice, letting it splash across the table and onto the floor. "Oops," Davies said with a smirk. "Butterfingers. Hey, cleaning lady, got another mess for you over here." Maria approached with her mop and bucket, moving with that same careful control Jake had noticed before. But this time, he could see the tension in her neck, the way her grip on the mop handle had tightened. "You know what?" Davies continued, standing up as Maria began to clean. "I don't think you're doing a very good job. This place is still dirty." He grabbed the salt shaker and deliberately poured salt all over the area Maria had just cleaned. "There. Now it really needs attention." Several Marines around the dining hall had stopped eating to watch. Some looked uncomfortable with Davies' behavior, but others were grinning, enjoying the show. Jake felt sick to his stomach. This had gone way beyond harmless pranks. Maria stopped mopping. She stood completely still for a long moment, her head down, breathing carefully. When she finally looked up at Davies, something had changed in her expression. The quiet, submissive demeanor was gone, replaced by something harder, more focused. "Corporal Davies," she said, her voice steady and clear. The slight accent was still there, but now it carried an unmistakable tone of authority that made several Marines straighten up instinctively. Davies laughed. "Oh, so you know my name? That's cute. What are you gonna do? Report me to my commanding officer? I'm sure they'll be really concerned about the feelings of a—" "You will clean up this mess," Maria interrupted, her voice cutting through his words like a blade. "You will do it now, and you will apologize to every person in this dining hall for disrupting their meal." The dining hall had gone completely silent. Even Davies seemed taken aback by the sudden change in Maria's tone. For a moment, he looked uncertain, as if some deep instinct was telling him he'd made a serious mistake. But then, his arrogance reasserted itself. "Lady, you're completely out of your mind if you think I'm taking orders from you. You're nobody. You're just a—" Maria moved faster than Jake would have thought possible. In one smooth motion, she stepped forward, grabbed Davies' wrist, and twisted it in a way that sent him immediately to his knees. It was a classic control hold, executed with the kind of precision that comes from years of training and practice. "I am Gunnery Sergeant Maria Santos, United States Marine Corps, retired," she said, her voice carrying across the silent dining hall. "I served 3 tours in Iraq and 2 in Afghanistan. I earned my stripes the hard way, and I've had enough of your disrespect." Davies was gasping in pain, his face pressed against the table. Maria held him there effortlessly, her technique perfect. Every Marine in the room recognized the professionalism of the hold. This wasn't random violence. It was controlled, military precision. "You have 30 seconds to apologize to everyone in this room," Maria continued, her voice calm but implacable. "Then you're going to clean up every mess you've made, not just today, but every day since you arrived at this base. And if I hear about you disrespecting any civilian worker, any female Marine, or anyone else who's just trying to do their job, you and I will have another conversation. Are we clear? 5. Rodistarm. We're Rodistarm. Yes, Gunny. Davies gasped, using the traditional term of respect for a gunnery sergeant. The words came out automatically, drilled into him by years of military training. Maria released him and stepped back, once again becoming the quiet woman with the mop. But everyone in the dining hall had seen the transformation, and there was no going back to the way things were before. Davies slowly got to his feet, his face red with embarrassment and pain. He looked around the room at all the Marines staring at him, many of whom were now looking at him with disgust rather than amusement. I apologize, he mumbled, not meeting anyone's eyes. I was out of line. Louder, Maria said quietly. I apologize, Davies said, his voice carrying across the room. I was completely out of line, and I disrespected all of you by acting like that. Maria nodded once, then handed him her mop. Clean up your mess, Corporal. All of it. As Davies began to clean up the spilled juice and salt, the normal sounds of the dining hall slowly resumed. But the atmosphere had completely changed. Marines were looking at Maria with new respect, some nodding to her as she passed their tables. Jake sat in stunned silence, trying to process what he'd just witnessed. Everything he'd suspected about Maria had been confirmed, and more. She wasn't just a former Marine. She was a senior non-commissioned officer, a gunnery sergeant who had served multiple combat tours. Sarah Williams approached Maria's table as she resumed her work. Gunny, she said respectfully, thank you for what you did. That was long overdue. Maria looked up at her and smiled for the first time Jake had ever seen. It completely transformed her face, revealing the person she'd been hiding beneath the quiet exterior. Just doing my job, Marine, Maria replied. Taking care of my people, even in retirement. Word of the incident spread through the base like wildfire. By lunchtime, everyone knew that the quiet woman in the dining hall was a decorated combat veteran who had earned her respect the hard way. But this revelation was only the beginning of the story. In the days following the incident with Corporal Davies, Jake found himself curious about Maria's story. How does a gunnery sergeant with multiple combat deployments end up working as a civilian in a base dining hall? The question nagged at him until he finally worked up the courage to approach her during a quiet moment. Gunny Santos, he said respectfully as she refilled the coffee dispensers. Could I ask you something? Maria looked at him with those sharp, assessing eyes that he now realized had been evaluating everyone around her for months. What's on your mind? Lance Corporal Morrison. Jake was surprised she knew his name and rank. He'd never introduced himself to her directly, which meant she'd been paying attention to the Marines around her more than anyone had realized. Well, ma'am, I was wondering, how did you end up here? I mean, working in the dining hall instead of doing Marine things? Maria finished with a slight smile. Quote, alone to abilities. She continued working as she spoke, her movements as efficient as ever. Jake sat at a nearby table while Maria continued her work. The dining hall was mostly empty, giving them privacy for what he sensed would be an important conversation. I enlisted in 1989, Maria began, when women weren't allowed in combat roles. But that didn't stop me from finding ways to serve on the front lines. I became a motor transport operator first, then cross-trained into logistics coordination. By the time the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan started, I was running supply convoys through some of the most dangerous territory in both countries. She paused to wipe down a table, and Jake noticed a small scar on her forearm that he'd never seen before. I was promoted to gunnery sergeant in 2005, which was rare for women at the time. I had Marines under my command, who trusted me to get them home alive. And I took that responsibility seriously. Very seriously. Maria's voice grew quieter, and Jake sensed they were approaching the heart of her story. My last deployment was in Afghanistan, 2011. I was leading a convoy that was supposed to be routine. Supplies to a forward operating base. Nothing we hadn't done dozens of times before, but we drove into an ambush. IED took out our lead vehicle, and we came under heavy fire from 3 directions. She stopped cleaning and looked directly at Jake. I lost 2 Marines that day. Good Marines. Kids who trusted me to bring them home. And I couldn't do it. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He'd heard stories like this before, but never from someone who'd lived through it. The official report said I handled the situation correctly. We fought our way out. Saved the rest of the convoy. Completed the mission. I even got a Bronze Star for it. But those 2 Marines never made it home. And that's something I carry every day. Maria resumed her work. But her movements were more mechanical now. As if the routine helped her manage difficult memories. I retired in 2013 after 24 years of service. Full pension, full honors, all the things you're supposed to want. But I couldn't settle into civilian life, couldn't find my purpose. My husband, he's a good man, retired Navy. He was patient with me, but I could see I was struggling. She gestured around the dining hall. So I came here. Not because I needed the money, but because I needed to be around Marines again. I needed to feel useful, taking care of you kids, making sure you have clean tables and fresh coffee. It might seem small, but it's my way of still serving. Jake was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd shared. Why didn't you tell anyone who you were? Maria smiled sadly. Because I wanted to earn your respect as Maria the dining hall worker, not as Gunnery Sergeant Santos. I wanted to prove that service comes in many forms, and that everyone deserves dignity regardless of their job title. But Corporal Davies needed to learn a lesson that only a senior NCO could teach him, Maria said firmly. Some Marines respond to kindness and patience. Others need to understand hierarchy and respect. Davies was the second type. Then, Marines respond. Over the following weeks, word of Maria's story spread throughout the base. Marines began stopping by to talk with her, sharing their own struggles and concerns. She became an unofficial counselor, someone who understood the unique challenges of military life because she'd lived them herself. Jake watched as Maria's role at the base evolved. She still did her job with the same quiet professionalism. But now Marines sought her out for advice, especially those dealing with deployment stress or family problems. Her experience as a combat leader, combined with her genuine care for the Marines around her, made her invaluable in ways that had nothing to do with cleaning tables. The base commander, Colonel Patricia Hayes, eventually learned about Maria's background and offered her a position as a civilian family readiness coordinator, helping military families deal with deployment challenges. But Maria politely declined. With respect, Colonel, she said during their meeting, I'm exactly where I need to be. These Marines see me every day. They know I'm here, and they know I care about them. That's worth more than any office job. Davies, meanwhile, had become a different Marine entirely. The humiliation of being schooled by someone he'd dismissed as just a cleaning lady had forced him to examine his own attitudes and behavior. He began volunteering for extra duties, helped newer Marines adjust to base life, and never again showed disrespect to civilian workers. One day, Jake found Davies helping Maria move heavy boxes of supplies. You know, Davies said quietly, I served with some tough Marines, but I don't think I ever met anyone tougher than Gunny Santos. The stuff she went through, and she's still here taking care of people. Makes you think about what real strength looks like. 6 months after the dining hall incident, Maria was recognized at the base's annual awards ceremony. Colonel Hayes presented her with a Civilian Service Award, but more importantly, she was surrounded by dozens of Marines who had come to see her honored. As she stood at the podium, no longer the invisible woman in the background, Maria looked out at the sea of young faces and smiled. Marines, she said, her voice carrying easily across the auditorium. Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform. It doesn't matter if you're a general or someone who cleans tables. What matters is that you take care of each other, that you maintain your standards, and that you never forget the values that make you a Marine. The standing ovation lasted for several minutes. Jake, watching from the audience, realized that Maria Santos had taught them all something valuable about dignity, respect, and the many different ways to serve. She might have retired from the Marine Corps, but she would always be a Marine, whether she was wearing dress blues or a civilian work uniform. The quiet woman at the base had revealed not just who she really was, but who they all could become. Marines who understood that true strength comes from lifting others up, not putting them down. And in a world that often overlooks the contributions of those working quietly in the background, Maria Santos had reminded an entire base that everyone deserves respect, and everyone has a story worth knowing.